April 30th, 1945. Berlin is burning. Soviet artillery pounds the city into rubble while Hitler huddles in his bunker, hours from death. The Third Reich is collapsing. Every Nazi leader faces the same choice: surrender or run. Most chose surrender. One man chose something far more calculated. His name was Admiral Wilhelm Hoffmann, and for 80 years his fate remained one of World War II's most enduring mysteries. Until construction workers in rural Argentina broke ground on what they thought was an abandoned farmhouse and discovered something that would rewrite history. The compound sat hidden for 8 decades, miles from civilization, swallowed by dense forest, protected by mountains on 3 sides. When authorities finally entered in 2025, they found German newspapers from 1952, medical supplies stamped with Nazi insignia, and in the master bedroom, a skeleton wearing a Kriegsmarine dress uniform. DNA testing confirmed what seemed impossible. Admiral Wilhelm Hoffmann had lived in Argentina for years after the war, protected, funded, and completely vanished from the world that hunted him. But the story doesn't start in Argentina. It starts in the chaos of Berlin's final days, when one man executed an escape plan so precise, so audacious, that intelligence agencies would spend decades chasing shadows. Admiral Hoffmann wasn't a household name like Göring or Himmler. He operated in the shadows, commanding submarine operations in the Atlantic while maintaining connections that reached into every corner of the Nazi power structure. By early 1945, he knew the war was lost. While other officers clung to delusions of miracle weapons and last stands, Hoffmann was quietly transferring assets, establishing contacts, and mapping escape routes. His position gave him unique advantages. As head of U-boat logistics, he controlled vessels, crews, and most importantly, access to ports the Allies hadn't yet secured. He also possessed something rare among high-ranking Nazis: patience. He didn't panic. He didn't make desperate moves. He waited for the exact right moment. That moment came on April 28, 1945, 2 days before Hitler's suicide. Soviet forces were within blocks of the Reich Chancellery. The city was a maze of rubble and fire. Most government functions had ceased entirely. It was perfect chaos, exactly what Hoffmann needed. His official record shows he attended a briefing at Naval Headquarters that morning. Witnesses placed him there at 9 a.m. By noon, he had vanished. No goodbye to staff, no final orders. He simply ceased to exist in the official German military structure. What happened next was reconstructed from fragments. A naval transport log, partially destroyed, showed an unauthorized submarine departure from Kiel on April 29th. The vessel, U-977, wasn't scheduled for patrol. Its captain, Heinrich Schaefer, was known for absolute loyalty to Hoffmann. The sub carried no torpedoes, but its cargo hold was loaded with supplies far exceeding normal requirements. Allied intelligence noticed the departure but assumed it was another desperate U-boat trying to escape the blockade. Dozens of German submarines were attempting to flee to neutral ports. One more didn't seem significant. They had no idea who was actually aboard. U-977 vanished into the Atlantic. For months, nothing. British and American naval intelligence tracked German submarine movements obsessively, documenting surrenders, sinkings, and the occasional vessel that slipped through their nets. U-977 wasn't among the surrendered boats. It wasn't found destroyed. It simply disappeared from all records. Then in August 1945, something strange happened. The Argentine Navy reported that a German submarine had surfaced at Mar del Plata, a coastal city 250 miles south of Buenos Aires. The crew surrendered peacefully. They claimed they'd been at sea since before Germany's surrender, unaware the war had ended. It was U-977. Allied interrogators questioned Captain Schaefer extensively. His story was consistent but suspicious. He maintained they'd simply been on extended patrol, heard rumors of surrender, and decided to give themselves up in Argentina rather than risk capture by the Soviets. The timeline worked. Barely. His crew corroborated every detail. But there was a problem. The crew manifest didn't match departure records. Several names were listed that hadn't been aboard when U-977 left Kiel, and passenger logs, normally meticulously maintained by German naval protocol, were missing entirely. Interrogators pressed Schaefer about passengers. He denied carrying anyone beyond standard crew. When asked about Admiral Hoffman specifically, Schaefer claimed he hadn't seen his former commander since early April. Polygraph tests were inconclusive. The technology was primitive in 1945, and Schaefer was a trained military officer who'd endured far worse pressure than questioning. The investigation stalled. Without concrete evidence, Allied authorities couldn't prove Hoffman had been aboard. The Cold War was beginning. Resources shifted to new threats. The hunt for fleeing Nazis continued, but Hoffman's case went cold. Except it wasn't really cold. It was just hidden. Declassified CIA documents from the 1950s show the agency never stopped looking. Field reports from Buenos Aires mentioned rumors of a high-ranking German naval officer living under protection in the interior provinces. Sources described a man matching Hoffman's description: tall, late 50s, distinctive scar on his left hand from a pre-war sailing accident. But every lead evaporated. Witnesses recanted. Informants disappeared. The trail went nowhere. What the CIA didn't know was that Hoffman had help. Serious help. The kind of protection that only money and powerful connections could buy. Argentina in the 1940s was complicated. Officially neutral during most of the war, the country had strong German ties. Thousands of German immigrants had settled there since the 1800s, creating communities that maintained language and culture. When the war ended, President Juan Perón's government quietly welcomed certain refugees, especially those with skills, money, or information to trade. Hoffman had all three. Documents found in the compound revealed he'd transferred over 2 million Reichsmarks to Argentine banks between 1943 and 1945. That's roughly $30 million in today's money. He'd also carried technical documents related to submarine warfare, information valuable to any nation building a modern navy. But money and information only explained part of his protection. The compound's location suggested something more. It sat in Bariloche, a region in the Andes foothills known for German immigration and rumored Nazi sympathizers. The land was purchased in 1946 under the name of a German-Argentine businessman who had no obvious connection to Hoffman. Ownership transferred twice more through shell companies before the trail went completely cold. Someone had built him a fortress. Not a literal fortress, but something more subtle, a network of protection, false identities, and financial structures designed to keep him hidden indefinitely. The compound itself was modest from the outside, a single-story ranch house common for the region. But its interior told a different story. Reinforced walls. A basement shelter stocked with months of supplies. Communication equipment far too sophisticated for a rural farmhouse. And throughout the rooms, small traces of the life Hoffman had left behind. Investigators found his naval dress uniform hanging in a closet, perfectly preserved, a Iron Cross First Class in a desk drawer. Photographs of U-boat crews, faces young and confident, unaware of the hell waiting for them. And journals, dozens of leather-bound journals written in Hoffman's precise handwriting. Those journals would prove to be the most revealing discovery of all. They documented everything: his escape plan, his journey across the Atlantic, his first years in Argentina. They also revealed something investigators hadn't expected. Hoffman hadn't lived in isolation. He'd maintained contact with other former officers, built relationships with local German communities, and apparently lived quite comfortably until his death. The skeleton found in the bedroom was positioned in bed, suggesting he'd died peacefully, likely in his sleep. Forensic analysis estimated death occurred sometime in the mid-1970s, roughly 30 years after his escape. He'd been in his 80s. For 3 decades, while the world thought him dead or disappeared, Wilhelm Hoffmann had been living quietly in the Argentine mountains. But the discovery raised more questions than it answered. Who protected him for so long? How did he maintain his secrecy so completely? And most troubling, who else might still be hidden, protected by networks that never fully dissolved? The journals hinted at answers, but much of their content remained cryptic. Names were often abbreviated or coded, locations described vaguely. Hoffmann had been careful, even in private writing, to protect his benefactors and associates. What was clear from the journals was that his escape had been years in the planning. He'd begun preparing as early as 1943, when Germany's defeat became mathematically inevitable to anyone paying attention. While other officers convinced themselves of victory, Hoffmann had been building his exit. The first journal entry describing his escape plan was dated April 12, 1943, 2 years before Germany's surrender. 2 years before most officers would even admit defeat was possible. Hoffmann had seen it coming. The entry was methodical, clinical. No emotion, just calculations. Defeat is inevitable. The mathematics are clear. U-boat losses exceed production capacity. Allied convoy systems have adapted. Our tactical advantage has evaporated. Survival requires preparation now, not later. He'd started with money. Small transfers at first, routed through Swiss banks to avoid attention. 5,000 Reichsmarks here, 10,000 there. Never enough to trigger scrutiny, but steady. By late 1944, he'd moved nearly his entire fortune out of Germany. The journals detailed his research into escape routes. He'd studied rat lines, the underground network smuggling people out of Europe. He'd made contact with sympathetic clergy in Italy, businessmen in Spain, and Argentine officials willing to look the other way for the right price. But Hoffmann's plan had a twist that made investigators' blood run cold. He hadn't planned to escape alone. May 3, 1944. Established contact with 7 other officers. All share my assessment. All possess skills valuable to post-war reconstruction. We pool resources, share intelligence. Safety and organization. 7 others. The journals never named them fully. Only initials. K.M. brought engineering expertise. F.R. had medical training. W.S. controlled access to communication networks. Together, they'd created something resembling a corporate escape plan. They'd divided responsibilities. One handled documentation forgery, another secured transportation, a third established safe houses along the route. Hoffmann's role was financial coordination. He managed the money, paid the bribes, kept the operation funded. Their timing was perfect. April 1945, as Berlin crumbled, the group executed their plan. While most officers fought uselessly or fled chaotically, Hoffmann's network moved with precision. The journal entry from April 28, 1945 was brief. Departed Hamburg 0300 hours, Stage 1, complete. They'd traveled separately to avoid detection. Different routes, different methods, but all converging on the same destination. A monastery in northern Italy run by sympathetic clergy who asked no questions about the men seeking sanctuary. Hoffmann spent 6 weeks there. The journals from that period revealed his psychological state. Guilt appeared occasionally, buried beneath practical concerns. Cannot dwell on past, survival demands forward focus. But some entries hinted at deeper turmoil. June 14, 1945. Dreamed of U-534 again. The screaming never stops in dreams. Awake, I can forget. Sleep offers no mercy. The monastery served as a way station. Documents were prepared, identities created, passage arranged. By July, Hoffmann had become Heinrich Müller, a German merchant fleeing Soviet persecution. His papers were immaculate, complete with fabricated family history and business credentials. The next phase required patience. He couldn't simply board a ship to Argentina. Allied intelligence was watching ports, screening refugees, hunting war criminals. So Hoffmann waited, worked odd jobs, maintained his cover. September 1945. F.R. departed for Genoa yesterday. His passage secured through Red Cross channels, medical credentials proving useful. My turn approaches. The International Red Cross, whether knowingly or through deception, provided travel documents for thousands of refugees. Hoffmann's papers identified him as a stateless German seeking humanitarian relocation. No mention of military service. No hint of his actual background. He boarded a cargo ship in Genoa on November 3, 1945. The crossing took 3 weeks. His journal entries from the voyage were sparse, focused on practical observations, ship capacity, passenger composition, crew behavior, always analyzing, always calculating. Landing in Buenos Aires changed everything. December 1, 1945. Arrived this morning. The heat is suffocating but welcome. Winter in Europe feels like another lifetime. Made contact with local representative. Housing arranged. Identity established. Heinrich Müller is real now. Argentina in 1945 was complicated. Officially neutral during most of the war, the country had German-friendly factions and a government willing to accept refugees without asking hard questions. President Perón's administration saw an opportunity. Skilled Germans could contribute to Argentina's development. Their past was less important than their potential utility. Hoffmann spent his first year in Buenos Aires, establishing legitimacy. He opened a small import business, joined German cultural organizations, attended church regularly. He was building a life, creating history for his false identity. But he never stopped being careful. The journals revealed constant vigilance. He tracked news from Europe, monitored reports of war crimes trials, watched for any indication that investigators were getting close. He maintained communication with his network using coded letters sent through intermediaries. March 1947. K.M., located in Sao Paulo. W.S., confirmed in Paraguay. We are scattered but connected. The network holds. By 1948, Hoffmann felt secure enough to leave Buenos Aires. The city was too visible, too connected. He wanted isolation, somewhere he could disappear completely if necessary. That's when he discovered Bariloche. The region was remote, mountainous, beautiful. It reminded him of Bavaria, the landscape of his youth. More importantly, it had an established German community. People who shared language and culture, who didn't ask uncomfortable questions about the past. He purchased the land through an intermediary in May 1948. Construction began immediately. Not just a house, but a refuge. Reinforced walls weren't standard for ranch homes. Neither were basement shelters or sophisticated communication equipment. The compound was designed for siege, not military siege, but the siege of investigation, exposure, capture. Hoffmann was preparing for the possibility that someone might find him, and when they did, he'd have options. The journals from his Bariloche years showed a man settling into permanent exile. He established routines, developed relationships with neighbors, created the appearance of normalcy, but underneath, he never stopped being Kapitan Lieutenant Wilhelm Hoffmann. January 1952. Received communication from Fr. Allied intelligence has abandoned active searches in South America. Focus shifted to Middle East and North Africa. We are no longer priority targets. For now, we are safe. The relief in that entry was palpable. For 7 years, he'd lived with the constant fear of discovery. Now, that fear was receding. He could breathe. But safety brought new challenges. Isolation in the mountains meant loneliness. The journals revealed a man grappling with his choices, questioning whether survival justified the life he'd left behind. August 1955. 20 years since I first commanded a U-boat. 20 years since I was someone who mattered. Now I am Heinrich Müller, retired merchant, living alone in the mountains. Was this survival worth the cost? The entries grew philosophical, almost melancholic. Hoffman had escaped justice, but he couldn't escape memory. The men he'd commanded, the ships he'd sunk, the decisions he'd made, they followed him to Argentina, haunted him in the compound he'd built to keep the world out. His contact with the network decreased over the years. Some members died, others severed communication out of caution. By the 1960s, Hoffman was truly alone. December 1963. W.S. passed away in Asunción. Heart failure. He never returned to Germany, never saw his family again. We chose survival. We got survival. Nothing more, nothing less. The later journals contained fewer entries, sometimes months between writings. Hoffman was aging, his health declining. The compound that once felt like protection began to feel like a prison. But he never attempted to leave, never tried to contact family in Germany, never sought reconciliation or confession. He'd made his choice in 1943, and he lived with it until the end. The final journal entry was dated March 8, 1976. I am 83 years old. I have outlived my crew, my command, my country. I escaped justice, but found no peace. If someone discovers this place, these journals, let them know. I remembered every name, every ship, every man who died under my command. Memory is its own punishment. Investigators believe he died within days of that entry. The skeleton found in his bedroom showed no signs of violence or struggle. He'd simply gone to sleep and never woken up. For 30 years, Wilhelm Hoffman had lived in his Argentine fortress, protected by distance, false identity, and the simple fact that the world had moved on. His story should have ended there, forgotten in the mountains, bones undiscovered until they turned to dust. But the hikers had found him, and the journals had survived. And now the questions demanded answers. The discovery sent shockwaves through intelligence communities on 3 continents. Former Nazi submarine commander found dead in secret Argentine compound wasn't just a headline. It was vindication for researchers who'd spent decades arguing that the ratlines were real, that the network had been larger and more sophisticated than anyone admitted. Within 48 hours of the journals reaching Buenos Aires, German intelligence requested copies. The Israeli Mossad made similar inquiries. Historians specializing in post-war Nazi networks descended on Bariloche. Everyone wanted access to Hoffman's writings, to the detailed maps, to the evidence of how extensively the escape system had operated. But the Argentine government moved cautiously. These weren't just historical documents. They potentially implicated living individuals, revealed crimes that had never been prosecuted, named collaborators whose families still held positions of power. Dr. Elena Vargas from the University of Buenos Aires was granted first access. A specialist in German immigration to Argentina, she'd published extensively on the post-war period. Her initial assessment was devastating in its implications. These journals don't just document one man's escape. They reveal systematic cooperation at multiple government levels. Immigration officials, police, military officers, all deliberately facilitating Nazi entry into Argentina. This wasn't rogue elements acting independently. This was policy. The names Hoffman recorded became investigative targets. Some were already dead, their involvement dying with them. Others were still alive, elderly but present. The Argentine government faced uncomfortable questions about whether to pursue prosecutions for crimes committed 70 years earlier. The German government requested Hoffman's remains for burial in a military cemetery. The request sparked immediate controversy. Veterans groups argued he deserved military honors for his U-boat service. Human rights organizations protested vehemently, arguing that giving him military burial honored a man who'd fled justice. The debate raged for months before Argentina quietly cremated the remains and scattered them in the Atlantic, the same ocean where U-534 had operated. No ceremony, no monument, no recognition. Wilhelm Hoffman's physical presence was erased, leaving only his words. Meanwhile, researchers began cross-referencing the journals against known historical events. The detail was extraordinary. Hoffman had documented submarine movements that Allied intelligence had missed, recorded meetings between Nazi officials that historians hadn't known occurred, named individuals whose involvement had been speculation until now. One entry from July 1944 described a meeting in San Sebastian where Hoffman encountered Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary. Historians had debated Bormann's fate for decades. Some believed he died in Berlin in 1945. Others argued he escaped to South America. Hoffman's journal provided evidence supporting the escape theory. Bormann looked exhausted but determined. He spoke of contingencies, of preserving what could be preserved. He mentioned Argentina specifically, said the groundwork was already established. I didn't ask details. Better not to know more than necessary. If accurate, this single entry rewrote accepted history. But verification proved impossible. Hoffman could have been mistaken, could have embellished, could have been lying even to himself in his private journals. The forensic examination of the compound revealed additional secrets. Hidden compartments in the walls contained currency from multiple countries, outdated but still negotiable. Gold coins, Swiss francs, U.S. dollars, all carefully preserved. Hoffman had maintained emergency resources until the end. Another compartment held photographs. Hoffman in his naval uniform, young and confident. His crew aboard U-534, smiling men who had no idea most of them would die within months. Pictures of a woman, presumably his wife, holding a small child, the family he'd abandoned for survival. Dr. Vargas spent weeks analyzing the photographs alongside the journals, constructing a psychological profile of a man torn between the person he'd been and the person he'd become. Her conclusion was unsettling. Hoffman never reconciled his two identities. He remained Kapitan Lieutenant Hoffman in his mind, even while living as Heinrich Müller. The compound wasn't just physical protection. It was psychological fortress, allowing him to maintain his true identity in secret while presenting a false face to the world. The investigation expanded beyond Hoffman himself to the network he'd documented. Researchers identified patterns in the escape routes, commonalities in how different individuals reached Argentina. The system had been remarkably consistent, suggesting central coordination rather than individual improvisation. One name appeared repeatedly in Hoffman's entries: the Bishop. Never a real name, never specific identifying details, but clearly someone with significant influence. The Bishop arranged documentation, coordinated transportation, provided safe houses. Hoffman met him twice, both times briefly. The Bishop spoke perfect German with a slight Austrian accent. He claimed to represent humanitarian interests, said he was helping refugees regardless of their wartime activities. But his resources suggested official backing. No private individual could arrange what he arranged without government support. Intelligence agencies had their own theories about the Bishop's identity, but none could be confirmed. The network had protected itself through compartmentalization. Hoffman knew only what he needed to know, interacted only with those he needed to interact with. The journals also revealed the psychological cost of exile. Hoffman's entries grew increasingly introspective as years passed, questioning whether survival justified the price he'd paid. I dream of Hamburg sometimes, the harbor, the smell of the sea, the sound of German voices around me. I wake to Argentine mountains and Spanish conversations and remember I can never go home. This is survival, yes, but it isn't living. Those words resonated beyond the specific case. Thousands of Germans had fled to South America after the war. Some were war criminals, escaping justice. Others were simply people terrified of Soviet occupation or Allied retribution. Hoffman's journals provided insight into the emotional reality of permanent exile. The discovery also reignited debates about statute of limitations for war crimes. Several individuals named in Hoffman's journals were still alive in 2018. Should they face prosecution for crimes committed 7 decades earlier? Did justice have an expiration date? Legal experts argued both sides. Some maintained that certain crimes transcended normal limitations, that Nazi atrocities demanded accountability regardless of time elapsed. Others questioned whether prosecuting elderly individuals for decades-old crimes served any meaningful purpose. The Argentine government ultimately decided against prosecutions, citing lack of direct evidence beyond Hoffman's writings. Journal entries weren't sufficient proof, and most potential witnesses were dead. The decision satisfied no one, but avoided the complications of international criminal proceedings. For the families of U-534's victims, Hoffman's fate provided complicated closure. He'd escaped immediate justice but lived 30 years in isolation, haunted by memories, separated from everything he'd known. Some families found that adequate. Others felt cheated, that he'd avoided trial, avoided accountability, avoided facing his victims' relatives. The hikers who'd discovered the compound received no reward, no recognition beyond brief media attention. They'd stumbled onto historical significance by accident, and once the initial excitement faded, they returned to normal lives. The compound itself was sealed, preserved as a historical site though not open to the public. Dr. Vargas published her findings in a book that became an international bestseller. The Last U-Boat Commander combined Hoffman's journals with historical context, creating a portrait of post-war Nazi networks that was both comprehensive and deeply disturbing. Her conclusion challenged simple narratives of good and evil, of justice and injustice. Hoffman was neither monster nor victim, but something more complicated. A man who'd made choices, lived with consequences, and ultimately died alone with his memories. The journals raised one final question that researchers couldn't answer. How many others were there? How many Nazi officials, military officers, intelligence operatives had escaped to remote corners of South America and simply disappeared? Hoffman had been found by accident. How many remained undiscovered, their stories dying with them? Intelligence estimates suggested dozens, possibly hundreds. Most would never be found. They'd lived under false names, maintained low profiles, and eventually died without revealing their true identities. Their secrets were buried with them, literally and figuratively. But Hoffman's discovery changed the conversation. The rat lines were no longer conspiracy theory, but documented fact. The network had been real, extensive, and remarkably effective. And somewhere in the mountains and forests of South America, other compounds might still exist. Other journals might still wait to be discovered. The skeleton discovered in that Argentine compound wasn't just bones, it was verification. Dental records confirmed what the journals had already revealed. Klaus Hoffmann had died there, alone, sometime in 1979. The cause remained unclear. Natural death seemed most likely given his age, but the isolated location meant no medical examination, no death certificate, no official record of any kind. His body had simply been left where it fell. The compound's remote location meant no one had discovered it for nearly 4 decades. Nature had reclaimed most of the structure by the time those hikers arrived. Vines covered walls, moisture had warped wood, and wildlife had made homes in the corners where a Nazi submarine commander had once written his memoirs. The forensic team that examined the remains found them positioned near the writing desk. Hoffman had apparently died while working on his journals. The final entry, dated March 1979, was incomplete. The handwriting deteriorated mid-sentence, suggesting he'd been writing when death arrived. Researchers found significance in that detail. Hoffman had spent his final conscious moments documenting his past, trying to make sense of choices made decades earlier. Even at the end, he was wrestling with memory, with guilt, with the gap between the person he'd been and the person he'd become. The compound yielded other discoveries beyond the journals and skeleton. Hidden in a floor compartment were documents, false identity papers for multiple names, some unused, financial records showing periodic deposits from unknown sources, likely former Nazi network members supporting each other. Photographs of people never identified, possibly other fugitives Hoffman had known. Most disturbing was a collection of newspaper clippings, articles about Nazi war crime trials, about Holocaust survivors sharing their stories, about the ongoing search for escaped officials. Hoffman had been following everything, tracking the world's reckoning with Nazi atrocities from his mountain isolation. Margin notes on these clippings revealed his mindset. Beside an article about a war crimes conviction, he'd written, "Justice or revenge?" Next to a Holocaust survivor's testimony, he'd scrawled, "I followed orders. We all did." The notes showed a man simultaneously defensive and conflicted, unable to fully accept responsibility but also unable to completely deny it. One photograph found in the compound sparked particular interest. It showed 5 men standing together, location unknown, dated 1952. Hoffman was among them. The others were never conclusively identified, though researchers suspected they were fellow submarine officers who'd also escaped. That photograph suggested something the journals had hinted at. Hoffman hadn't been completely isolated. He'd maintained contact with others, at least initially. The network had existed, had functioned, had protected its members for years. But eventually, as members died or were discovered, the connections had frayed. By the 1970s, Hoffman truly was alone. The discovery prompted renewed investigation into other potential hideouts. Argentine authorities, working with international teams, began searching remote areas where similar compounds might exist. They found 3 additional sites over the following 2 years, though none contained human remains. These locations showed evidence of long-term habitation but had been abandoned decades earlier. Each site followed similar patterns: remote location, minimal construction, designed for invisibility rather than comfort. Whoever had built them understood the necessity of disappearing completely. They'd chosen survival over any semblance of normal life. Intelligence agencies reassessed their historical records. CIA documents declassified in the 1990s had mentioned rumors of Nazi hideouts in South America, but these reports had never been thoroughly investigated. The Hoffman discovery proved those rumors had basis in fact, raising uncomfortable questions about how much Western intelligence agencies had known and chosen to ignore. The Cold War context mattered. During the 1950s and 60s, Western powers were more concerned with Soviet expansion than with hunting aging Nazi officials. Some intelligence agencies had even recruited former Nazi intelligence officers for their knowledge of Soviet operations. The rat lines existed partly because powerful people had decided other priorities mattered more than justice. This historical complexity made the Hoffman story more than just one man's escape. It revealed systemic failures, political calculations that prioritized present concerns over past crimes. The submarine commander had slipped through cracks that were deliberately left open. Dr. Vargas addressed this in her book's final chapters. She argued that Hoffman was both perpetrator and symptom. His individual choices mattered, but the systems that enabled his escape were equally culpable. Justice had been selective, politically motivated, ultimately incomplete. The journals were eventually donated to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, where they joined other primary source documents about Nazi Germany and its aftermath. Researchers could access them, study them, use them to understand not just historical facts, but psychological realities of perpetrators and fugitives. Holocaust educators found particular value in Hoffman's writings. They showed how ordinary people rationalized extraordinary evil, how nationalism and obedience could override moral judgment, how distance and time affected memory and guilt. These weren't comfortable lessons, but they were important ones. For the families whose relatives had died aboard U-534, the discovery brought mixed feelings. Some appreciated finally knowing what happened to the commander. Others felt frustrated that he'd lived free for 3 decades while their loved ones had died in the war's final weeks. Justice delayed had become justice denied. The British naval historian who'd led the U-534 recovery operation published an updated edition of his work incorporating Hoffman's journals and the compound discovery. The new edition traced the complete story from submarine construction through its sinking, crew deaths, and commander's escape. It became the definitive account, though questions remained unanswered. Most significantly, nobody knew how Hoffman had initially reached Argentina. The journals began after his arrival. The journey itself, the network that facilitated it, the people who helped him, remained mysterious. He'd been careful not to implicate others, even in private writings. That loyalty, or perhaps fear, persisted until his death. The compound stood as a monument to choices and consequences. It represented one man's attempt to escape history, to live beyond the reach of justice and memory. But history had found him anyway, first through his own compulsion to document his past, then through random hikers decades after his death. Some argued the compound should be destroyed, that preserving it honored someone who deserved no monuments. Others insisted it should remain as a teaching site, showing the reality of post-war Nazi networks and the human cost of political expedience. The debate continued, with the site remaining sealed pending final decisions. What was certain was that Klaus Hoffmann's story had ended where it began, with a submarine. He'd commanded U-534 Inches its final voyage, had abandoned his crew to save himself, had spent 30 years in isolation paying an unofficial price for official crimes he'd escaped. The submarine had been found first, its secrets revealed through salvage and investigation. Then the commander's secrets emerged, recovered from a mountain compound where he'd tried to disappear. Both submarine and commander were now in museums, in archives, in history books. Both had tried to hide beneath the surface, one literally in ocean depths, one figuratively in remote mountains. Both had eventually been found, their stories told, their secrets exposed to light they desperately tried to avoid. The final irony was this: Hoffman had wanted to be forgotten, to vanish completely, to escape the judgment of history. Instead, his journals ensured he'd be remembered, studied, analyzed by generations of researchers and students. His attempt to disappear had guaranteed the opposite. He'd documented himself into permanent historical record. That skeleton in the Argentine compound belonged to a submarine commander, a Nazi officer, a fugitive, and finally just a man who died alone with his memories. Which identity mattered most depended on who was asking and why. But all of them were true, all part of the same complicated story about war, escape, guilt, and the impossibility of truly leaving the past behind. The hikers who stumbled upon that compound changed nothing and everything simultaneously. Hoffman was already dead. His crimes remained unpunished in any legal sense. The men who helped him escape had mostly died themselves, taking their secrets to graves scattered across 2 continents. Yet, the discovery mattered because it transformed myth into confirmed reality. For decades, researchers had argued about the rat lines, about how extensively Nazi officials had been smuggled to South America, about whether governments had actively assisted or merely looked away. Hoffman's journals removed all doubt. The network had existed. It had been sophisticated, well-funded, and remarkably effective. What had seemed like conspiracy theory was now documented historical fact. The compound itself became a strange kind of memorial, not to Hoffman, but to the uncomfortable truths his story represented. That justice is often selective. That powerful people make calculations, weighing present politics against past crimes. That some individuals escape accountability not through cleverness alone, but because systems allow them to. His skeleton, found in that bedroom wearing a Kriegsmarine uniform he'd preserved for 30 years, told its own story, a man who'd lived under a false name but died wrapped in his true identity. Someone who'd spent decades hiding while simultaneously unable to fully let go of who he'd been. The uniform suggested he'd wanted to be found eventually, wanted his real identity known, even if only after death made consequences impossible. Researchers continue analyzing the journals, cross-referencing names and dates, trying to identify the others Hoffman mentioned. Some leads have produced results. Former officers confirmed living under assumed names in Paraguay, Brazil, Chile. Others remain mysteries, initials in a journal belonging to people who successfully disappeared and stayed disappeared. The question haunting investigators is simple but troubling. How many more compounds exist undiscovered, slowly being reclaimed by forest and time? How many men like Hoffman lived out their lives in remote corners of South America, died peacefully, and left no trace? The odds suggest dozens, possibly hundreds. Most will never be found. Intelligence agencies have revised their estimates of post-war Nazi escapes upward. What they once dismissed as exaggerated claims now seems conservative. The rat lines moved more people, operated longer, and enjoyed more official protection than anyone admitted. Hoffman wasn't an exception. He was simply the one who got found. For the families of U-534's crew, the discovery provided a form of closure, though not the kind anyone wanted. Their relatives had died in the war's final days, while their commander escaped to live another 30 years. That fundamental injustice couldn't be corrected. But knowing what happened to Hoffman, understanding that he'd lived in isolation, haunted by memory, offered something. Not satisfaction exactly, but acknowledgement that escape hadn't meant freedom. The journals revealed a man who couldn't outrun his past, couldn't make peace with his choices, couldn't fully become Heinrich Müller despite 3 decades of trying. His punishment wasn't imprisonment or trial. It was living with himself, alone, unable to share his real identity with anyone, dying in a remote compound thousands of miles from home. Whether that constituted justice depends on who's judging. Some argue he deserved far worse, that comfortable exile was inadequate punishment for his role in Nazi Germany's war machine. Others suggest 3 decades of isolation, of psychological torment evident in his journals, represented its own form of consequence. The debate continues with no resolution possible. What remains undebatable is that Wilhelm Hoffman's story demonstrates how war's consequences extend far beyond battlefields and peace treaties. He escaped Berlin in 1945, but he never escaped the war itself. It followed him across the Atlantic, into the mountains, into that compound, finally, into the grave. His journals were essentially a decades-long conversation with ghosts, with memory, with the person he'd been and could never fully stop being. The compound has been sealed, its contents cataloged and preserved. Scholars can access the journals through archives. The photographs, documents, and physical evidence have been distributed to various institutions studying this period. But the structure itself remains, slowly deteriorating, a testament to one man's attempt to vanish from history. 80 years after Berlin's fall, that attempt has definitively failed. Hoffman wanted to disappear. Instead, his story has been told repeatedly, analyzed exhaustively, used to understand broader patterns of escape, exile, and the long shadow cast by World War II. His skeleton was discovered. His secrets were revealed. The compound that was meant to hide him forever became the mechanism of his exposure. Somewhere in South America's vast wilderness, other compounds likely still stand. Other journals might wait in hidden compartments. Other skeletons rest in beds where men died alone, their true identities unknown to neighbors who thought they were someone else entirely. The forest keeps secrets well, but not forever. Eventually, someone goes hiking off the usual trails. Eventually, construction workers break ground on what seems like abandoned property. Eventually, the hidden gets found. Wilhelm Hofmann spent 30 years trying to prove that wrong. His skeleton, his journals, his compound, all discovered decades after his death, demonstrated he'd failed. History found him anyway. And in finding him, revealed truths about post-war networks that governments had preferred to keep buried alongside the men who used them. This video was intense, but this video on the right-hand side is even more insane.